March 15, 1941, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, California. The air smelled of oil, hot steel, and old salt. A foggy morning curled over the waters of the Napa River, seeping into every crack of the shipyard, where men worked in layers of grit and cold. A welding torch hissed to life, its blue flame bouncing shadows off the underbelly of a half-built submarine. Among the din of riveters, cranes, and shouted orders stood a man with a notebook in his back pocket and frustration in his eyes. Edward Ted Nelson, age 36, born and raised in California, earned his living wielding flame against metal. $11 a day for back-breaking, mind-numbing work. But what set him apart wasn't how well he could weld. It was that he couldn't look at inefficiency without imagining how to fix it. And what he saw that morning made his blood boil. 12 men, one full shift. And all they managed was to fasten a single section of wooden decking to a steel frame. It was the same grueling method they'd used since the last war. Nuts, bolts, scaffolding, sweat, and stubborn silence from the Navy brass who refused to change anything. Ted stepped down from the platform, his boots clanging against steel. He took out his notebook and scrawled a line he had written before. There has to be a better way. This is madness. He had already figured out that better way. He had turned the problem over in his mind during long welding shifts, studying it from angles most officers had never even considered. Why were they still bolting from the top and threading nuts from underneath, with men crammed in 4-foot-high spaces like rats in a trap? Why build elaborate scaffolding just to reach places that didn't need to be reached? His idea was dangerously simple. Weld the studs directly to the steel frame from above. No scaffolding, no nuts, no teams working blindly from both sides. Just a single worker with a specialized welding gun. He even knew how to solve the one issue that had plagued engineers for 2 decades: vertical and overhead welds. The secret? Encasing the flux in a small ceramic cap so it wouldn't fall off when the weld wasn't flat. But none of that mattered. Not to the Navy, not to his supervisor, Lieutenant Morrison, who dismissed his sketches in less than 5 minutes. Not to the shipyard's chief welding engineer, who called it too easy to be real. And certainly not to the captain, who sent a polite form letter saying it would take 18 to 24 months for the Navy Bureau of Ships in New City, Washington, to review his suggestion. War was coming. Ted could feel it in the steel, in the whispered rumors from Honolulu, in the pressure mounting daily at Mare Island. Submarines were delayed over decking. America wasn't ready. But if the Navy wouldn't listen to one welder, maybe the welder had to stop asking and start doing. May 12, 1941, Vallejo, California. Ted's garage. The sparks in Ted's workshop weren't from anger anymore. They were from invention. He had cleared space behind his little cottage and built his prototype from scrap parts. A crude gun, spring-loaded, wired to an old welding rig. The key was his flux cap, ceramic, cheap, reliable. He tested it relentlessly on steel in every position. Horizontal, vertical, overhead. The studs held. The welds were strong. It worked. Every single time. His wife, Emma, stood at the door watching with quiet worry. "Ted, you're going to get yourself fired." "I might," he admitted, wiping sweat and soot from his brow. "But if I don't do this, somebody's son is going to die because a boat wasn't ready in time." June 20th, 1941. Mare Island Nelson handed in his resignation. Morrison barely looked up from his desk. "You're making a mistake, Nelson," he said. "No," Ted replied. "The mistake was thinking someone like me could make a difference in your system." He walked out of that gate with $11 in his pocket, a prototype in his garage, and no idea that within months, the same Navy that dismissed him would come crawling back. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. The bombs fell, and America woke up. Battleships burned. The Pacific Fleet lay wrecked. And suddenly, every shipyard in the country was working 3 shifts around the clock, begging for faster, better ways to build. Nelson's phone started ringing. First it was the Kaiser shipyards, then Bethlehem Steel, then, finally, Mare Island. Morrison's signature scrawled at the bottom of a purchase order for 60 guns and 20,000 studs. No apology. Just business. March 1942, San Leandro, California. Ted's company had grown from a 1-man garage to a 20-man operation in a cornfield warehouse. By summer, he had 150 workers producing 30 guns a day, each capable of welding a stud in under 1 second. Submarines that used to take a week for deck installation now took a single day. Every hour saved was a bullet dodged. Every day shaved off construction meant another vessel on the front lines. And the Navy, once deaf to his voice, now sent teams to study his process. November 19, 1942, San Leandro plant. A car pulled up. 5 officers in dress uniform stepped out. One of them, Captain Harrison, read from a statement. Mr. Nelson, the United States Navy has determined your invention has saved more than 5 million man-hours in ship construction to date. On behalf of the Secretary of the Navy, we award you this citation for exceptional contribution to the war effort. Ted blinked. He remembered the form letter, the rejection, the laughs. He accepted the citation with one thought pounding in his mind. This isn't for me. This is for every welder who saw a better way and was told to shut up and follow orders. The night after the citation ceremony, Ted Nelson sat alone in the corner of his workshop, the Navy's framed award resting against the wall, still wrapped in its cloth. He hadn't even opened it. The factory floor outside was silent for once. No buzzing guns, no freight trucks rolling in or out, just the creak of metal cooling from a hard day's work. The smell of hot steel still lingered in the air. Emma walked in, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "They gave you a medal, and you look like someone punched you in the gut." Ted chuckled dryly. "They gave me an apology with gold trim." He stared at the welding gun hanging on the wall, his first prototype. It was ugly, scorched, and bent in places, but it had worked. And now, nearly every shipyard in America used it. Not because someone high up believed in it, but because it proved itself. By the end of 1942, orders were pouring in faster than his team could fill them. Kaiser shipyards tripled their request. Bethlehem wanted modifications for their tankers. The new destroyer yards in New Orleans needed thousands of studs per month. Nelson's invention was no longer a curiosity. It was a necessity. But for Ted, this wasn't about money. He still took a modest salary, wore the same tan work pants every day, and could often be found on the line helping assemble the guns himself. The rest of the profits went straight back into expansion. New machines, more workers, better facilities. And then came the second wave of change. Women, as the war escalated and more men shipped off to the front, America turned to the women left behind to run the factories. Ted's shop was no exception. Within 6 months, a third of his workforce were women, many of whom had never handled a tool more complex than a sewing machine. But the beauty of Ted's invention was its simplicity. No brute strength required, no complex training. 1 push, 1 second, 1 weld. Ted watched as a young mother from Oakland named Ruthie operated a stud gun with precision and rhythm that matched the best men on the floor. She had lost her brother at Pearl Harbor. Now, she was building the decks that would send sailors out to stop it from happening again. He remembered something she said on her second week. "This isn't just a job, Mr. Nelson. Every stud I weld is 1 step closer to bringing our boys home." Ted nodded. "That's exactly right." January 1943. A new chapter. Begins by now, his little factory in San Leandro wasn't so little. The company had grown to over 200 workers and 2 shifts. The Navy awarded Nelson a follow-up order for 90 more guns, this time for the Essex-class carriers being constructed at Newport News. Each ship would carry nearly 90 aircraft. Each one would require over 20,000 welded studs. His technology was now part of the war machine. Decking, fittings, supports, cable brackets, equipment mounts. Everywhere you looked inside a ship, Nelson's studs were there. And still, Ted stayed out of the spotlight. One afternoon, a war correspondent from the San Francisco Chronicle came by, asking to do a profile on the man who built the gun that built the Navy. Ted declined. "Print a story about the welders," he said. "The girls on the line, the kids loading trucks at midnight. I'm just the guy who figured out a shortcut." The journalist nodded, but he wrote the piece anyway. The headline ran 3 days later. "Garage Inventor Helps Save U.S. Navy, 5 million hours." That's when the flood started. Letters from schools, universities, workers, engineers, even a few generals. But the most important one came from his old yard. Mare Island. February 1943. Letter from Morrison. It was short. Just a single page, typed on official Navy letterhead. "Nelson, I was wrong. We should have listened. Your idea didn't just work, it changed everything. For what it's worth, thank you." L. Morrison Ted didn't smile. He didn't frame the letter, but he folded it carefully and tucked it into the same notebook where he had first written, "There has to be a better way." The war was still raging. He didn't have time to gloat. There were still ships to build, lives to save. And in every shipyard across the country, people were finally asking the same question Ted had asked 2 years earlier. Isn't there a better way? And now they knew there was. The snow came early to the East Coast that year. March 4th, 1943. Camden, New Jersey. A train whistle echoed across the Delaware River as Ted Nelson stepped off a cold, soot-dusted platform. He zipped his worn jacket higher around his neck. The Navy had just greenlit a second Nelson plant, this one to serve the East Coast yards. New York, Norfolk, Charleston. They all needed guns and studs now. Lots of them. He stood in front of the empty warehouse they'd leased. Broken windows, rats in the corners, rusty conveyor belts left from some old shoe factory. Emma, who had flown in the day before, walked beside him, glancing around the dust-covered walls. "This is it?" she asked, half smiling. "This is the next chapter," Ted replied. It would be running within 60 days. April 28, 1943. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, back on the West Coast. The welders, who used to curse every bolt and scaffold, were now racing through deck installation faster than anyone thought possible. A new submarine, the USS Silversides, was being outfitted in record time. What used to take 2 weeks now took less than 48 hours. One welder scribbled on a wall inside the hull with chalk. "Nelson was here, in every damn stud." They weren't wrong. Every time a ship hit the water early, every time a sailor boarded a vessel that was ready ahead of schedule, Nelson's invention was there, quiet, uncelebrated, and holding it all together. May 11th, 1943, the E Award ceremony. The Navy brought brass bands, flags, photographers, and press to the San Leandro plant. The workers, most of them in oil-stained coveralls, lined up for their pins, a little white E on a blue background. The Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production was no small thing. Only 5% of war manufacturers received it. Nelson didn't want to speak, but they handed him the microphone anyway. He cleared his throat. "We didn't do this for awards. We did it because men out there are dying, and they need ships now, not next month. What we build in here gets them there faster. That's our job. That's our war." He looked at his team. Some were teenagers fresh off farms. Others were single mothers from Oakland. Some had lost brothers, husbands, sons. But here, in this factory, they were soldiers of steel. And the battle was being won. August 12, 1943. A knock at his door. Ted was home for the first weekend in weeks. He had just finished breakfast when a knock came at the front door. Emma answered it and called him over, eyes wide. A young sailor in uniform stood there, nervous, holding his cap in both hands. "You Nelson?" he asked. "I am. My name's Jack Kinney, sir. I'm just back from the USS Wahoo. We pulled into Mare Island 2 days ago for refit. I wanted to say thank you." Ted frowned. "What for?" "That deck you made us, those studs held. We got hit in the bow by a depth charge. Tore up half the front section. But that deck stayed sealed. Our CO said we'd have flooded if it hadn't been welded tight. Your gun probably saved our crew." He paused, then added, "Most of us made it back. And I thought you should know." Ted swallowed hard and looked away. "Come inside, son." September 27th, 1943. 10,000 studs per day. Nelson's 2 plants were now producing 10,000 studs per day. Nearly every ship in the Pacific Fleet had his fingerprints on it. The Essex-class carriers, massive floating fortresses, used over 20,000 studs each. The USS Yorktown, Intrepid, Lexington, all carried Nelson's work into battle. In 1 week that fall, the U.S. launched 19 new ships. Warships were no longer delayed by decking. Submarine hatches closed tighter. Aircraft catapults held firmer. Bulkhead brackets stayed secure under fire. Behind each weld was a second saved. Behind each second, a life spared. December 7th, 1943, 2 years after Pearl Harbor. Ted stood alone outside the San Leandro plant, watching the flag rise slowly to half-mast. 2 years ago, to the day, the country had been caught off guard. Today, it was a war machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. The factory gates buzzed with life behind him. Trucks rolled in. Workers clocked in. Sparks flew. Guns clicked. The war wasn't over. But America wasn't losing time anymore. And somewhere, on the other side of the world, a sailor stood on a deck welded into place not by bolts or scaffolds, but by a welder who once got laughed out of his boss's office. Ted lit a cigarette, took one long pull, and whispered to himself, "Happy anniversary, boys." We caught up. January 10th, 1944, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, New Hampshire. The Atlantic wind slapped hard against the New England coast, freezing salt spray onto cranes, steel hulls, and men's hands. At Portsmouth, a miracle was brewing. A miracle made not of magic, but minutes saved. It was happening in shadows beneath the decks. Inside the bellies of submarines where no sunlight reached, only steel and sweat. The USS Redfish, USS Ronquil, USS Razorback, and USS Scabbardfish, 4 submarines, were being prepared to launch on the same day. No one had ever done that before, not even the Germans, with all their supposed engineering superiority. Ted Nelson wasn't there in person. But his invention was every bulkhead mount, every piping support, every deck fastening. Thousands of welded studs held those submarines together. The Navy's own stats showed it. Nelson's stud welding had cut submarine deck installation from 6 days to 1. That one innovation alone had clawed back over 300 man-hours per boat. And now, that meant 4 new subs launched on January 27th, 1944. The Navy didn't issue press releases about welded studs, but Nelson knew. Somewhere in the world, sailors were alive because the enemy didn't get 6 more days. February 3rd, 1944. Nelson's Camden plant. Snow blanketed the factory roof, but inside, the air was thick with heat and motion. The new plant had grown beyond recognition. 4 full assembly lines, 300 workers, orders coming in every day, and now a request from a General Eisenhower himself. His office had sent a letter. Planning for Operation Overlord is underway. We've been advised of the efficiency gains your equipment provides. The War Department would like to explore options for expanding use in Army landing craft and logistical vessels. Ted read it twice, then folded it into his pocket. Operation Overlord? That was D-Day, and they wanted his guns to help launch the biggest invasion in human history. He looked across the line at a young woman guiding a stud gun with a grace and confidence that made him proud. Her name was Nora, just turned 21. Her fiancé was somewhere in France, an army medic. She hadn't seen him in 18 months, she waved to Ted. Need another 200 done by lunch, boss? You gonna slow me down? He laughed. I wouldn't dare. March 1944. Ships by the hour at the Kaiser yards in Richmond. Liberty ships were launching at an average of 3 per day. 3 ships, every day. Cargo, troops, guns, tanks, food, fuel. Each ship packed with Nelson's studs. One government analyst estimated that Liberty ships required up to 8,000 studs each. Multiply that by over 2,000 ships, and the numbers were staggering. Millions of studs, millions of seconds, millions of minutes saved. Nelson wasn't an inventor anymore. He was a key piece of the American war engine, but it wasn't going to his head. He still refused to ride in a company car. He still took his lunch with the welders. And he still worked 16 hours a day. April 6, 1944. Quiet meeting, loud consequences. A man in a gray suit visited Ted's plant quietly. No fanfare, no insignia, no last name, just Mr. James from Washington. He walked the factory floor, took notes, asked a few questions, and then motioned to Ted. Do you know, he said softly, what your little gun is doing to the Germans? Ted blinked. No, sir. Crushing them. Not with firepower. Not yet, but with time. They're building U-boats by hand. Carefully, slowly. Still drilling holes like it's 1916. We're pumping out subs in weeks that took them months. That's you, Mr. Nelson. You've turned minutes into missiles. Ted didn't know what to say. James offered a rare smile. They're calling you the man who welded the war together. June 6, 1944. D-Day storms slammed the French coast as 7,000 ships approached Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen. Landing craft roared through the waves, LCIs, LSTs, LCVPs, hundreds of them built using Nelson's welding method. His studs held the ramps that dropped onto Omaha Beach. They secured the gear, the guns, the armor plates, the steel bow doors that opened under enemy fire. Each second counted. Each fastened bracket meant the next soldier got out faster, carried more, or lived longer. Ted sat in his San Leandro office, the radio murmuring updates. Emma sat beside him, hands clasped. They listened as reporters crackled through the static. The landings are underway. Heavy resistance reported on Omaha. Higgins boats landing wave after wave. The beach is held. Ted didn't cry. He just stared at the floor and said, We got them there. In time. July 1944. The letter. He never expected. A handwritten letter arrived, marked simply, USS Redfish. Somewhere in the Pacific, inside, it read, Mr. Nelson, we just sunk a Japanese convoy. 5 ships. Our sub held up like a fortress, even after 2 depth charges knocked us around like a tin can. Your studs are still holding our sonar unit in place. You didn't build a tool. You built a weapon. Thank you. LTJG Mark Rogers. Ted showed the letter to no one. But that night, he taped it inside his locker door. January 1945, San Leandro, California. The war was tipping. Everyone could feel it. Berlin was crumbling in the east, and in the Pacific, island after island fell to the stars and stripes. But for Ted Nelson, this was no time to celebrate. His factories were hotter than ever. Orders were bigger, deadlines tighter, and the Navy had just made its largest request yet. 15,000 stud welding guns and 2.2 million flux-capped studs to be delivered in under 90 days. Most men would have choked. Ted simply rolled up his sleeves. That night, he stood in front of 400 workers, young, old, men, women, even a few wounded vets who had come home early and wanted to still do something useful. He looked at them and said, "We're not done yet. Those boys out there still need our steel to hold. Let's give them something they can stand on, crawl under, and trust with their lives." The crowd roared. No one went home early that week. February 1945. Expanding the battlefield stud welding was no longer just for decks and brackets. It had crept into every steel machine of war. In the air, B-29 Superfortress bombers used Nelson studs to anchor oxygen tanks, electrical conduits, and gunner seats. On land, Sherman tanks used them for ammo racks, fire extinguishers, and armor support braces. Fast welds meant faster repairs on the battlefield. A disabled tank could be patched and rolling within hours. The Army began testing Nelson's system for mobile field repair units. The Navy used them in floating dry docks. Even PT boats, small, fast, and deadly, used Nelson welds to mount their torpedo racks. If it was metal and it moved, chances were a Nelson stud held it together. March 10, 1945, the letter from Tokyo Well, not Tokyo exactly. It came from a classified military address in Guam, sealed with a stamp that read, "Confidential, eyes only." Ted opened it slowly. "Mr. Nelson, tonight, 334 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo. Over 100,000 enemy casualties in 6 hours. The worst firestorm in history. Our engineers report that your stud-welded mountings in the bomb bays held through 12 hours of continuous flight, turbulence, and enemy flak. Not a single failure. You may not wear a uniform, but your work reached Tokyo before any soldier did." Major General L.G. Harmon, U.S. Army Air Forces, Ted put the letter in his desk drawer. Then he stepped outside into the cool California air, leaned on the wall of his factory, and took one long breath. "We're welding our way across the world," he thought. April 1945. The fall of Berlin. The news broke like thunder. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. WW2 Day, Victory in Europe, came on May 8th. Celebrations erupted across the United States. Streets filled with music, tears, and sailors kissing strangers in the middle of Times Square. But inside Nelson's factories, the mood was mixed. One war was over, but another, the crueler one, was still raging in the Pacific. Japan refused to surrender. And now, all eyes turned toward a final invasion. Operation Downfall. The bloodbath to end all bloodbaths. Millions of men, tens of thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of landing craft. Nelson's factory got another telegram. "We need 30,000 stud guns. All available flux cap studs. Rush order. Final phase imminent." It wasn't signed. Just marked. Top priority. White House cleared August 6, 1945. Hiroshima, everything changed in a flash. The news came in whispers at first. Some kind of new bomb. An entire city gone. Then came Nagasaki. By August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war, the largest, bloodiest, most mechanized war in human history, was over. August 16th, 1945. A factory in silence. The next morning, for the first time in years, the Nelson plants fell quiet. No hum of arc guns, no clanging steel, no forklifts shrieking on the floor. Workers stood in silence, gathered outside around the flagpole. The stars and stripes fluttered at full height. Ted stepped up. His face was older, lined with exhaustion, but his hands were still stained with metal dust. "I told you once," he said. "We weren't doing this for awards. We were doing it to bring our boys home." He paused. "Well, they're coming home now." September 1945. A war hero with no uniform. He had no medals, no combat patches, no battlefield stories. But at a government reception in Washington, a senior admiral shook Ted's hand and whispered, "You probably saved more lives with that gun than most of us did with rifles." The numbers backed it. By the Navy's final count, over 50 million man-hours saved. Used on 203 submarines, 2,710 Liberty ships, 24 aircraft carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and countless landing craft. Every major Pacific invasion, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, featured ships built faster because of Nelson's innovation. Yet, despite all this, the newspapers barely mentioned him. One article in Popular Mechanics, a footnote in a naval engineering report. That was fine with Ted. He wasn't looking to be remembered. He was looking to solve problems. And he had. October 2nd, 1945. San Leandro, California, it ended like the flip of a switch. One day, trucks rolled in packed with urgent orders. Telegrams screamed in all caps, and warehouses were emptying faster than he could fill them. The next, cancellations, refunds, silence. Ted stood in the middle of his factory floor, watching the production lines slow to a crawl. His welding guns, once gold to every shipyard and war contractor, now sat in crates, untouched. The war was over, and with it, the desperate need for speed. He glanced at a board near the break room where orders used to be posted. 3 months ago, there wasn't an inch of space left. Now, a single sheet of paper hung there. Effective immediately. War contracts canceled. All government shipments frozen. The factory that once fed an empire of steel was now choking on its own inventory. October 12, 1945. Layoffs. Begin, he'd promised them he would never let them go. But Ted Nelson wasn't a magician. He was a welder, and welders couldn't conjure customers from thin air. With a heavy heart, he gathered the entire workforce at the end of the shift. Some had been with him since the garage days. Others had joined after losing sons in the Pacific. All had given him everything. He stood before them in the same worn boots and tan shirt he'd always worn. "The war is over," he began. "And that's a good thing. A damn good thing. But now we face a different battle. One without gunfire, without orders. We have to fight to stay alive. This time in the market, not on the battlefield. I can't keep you all on, not right now. I wish I could. You've built history. I will never forget it. And if I can build something new, I swear, I'll call every last one of you back." The silence that followed was worse than bombs. One woman wept quietly into her gloves. A man nodded, then whispered, "We'd do it all again, boss. No regrets." By the end of the month, over 300 workers were gone. November 1945. The ghost factory. Ted walked the aisles alone now. The floors still smelled like oil and iron, but there were no sounds, no spark of the arc, no hiss of compressed air. Just dust collecting on machines that had once fed warships and bombers. Emma found him one night asleep on the factory floor, curled up next to a prototype he'd built in 1941. "Come home," she whispered. "It's over." He looked up at her, eyes hollow. I don't know what to do without a war to fight. January 1946, the pivot. But Ted Nelson wasn't the kind of man who vanished when the noise stopped. He had seen what his gun could do, and he knew this wasn't just a wartime tool, it was a universal solution to an ancient problem. Attaching metal to metal. Fast, clean, strong. That wasn't just useful in a submarine, it was useful in every damn thing made of steel. Bridges, skyscrapers, rail cars, construction, pipelines, automobiles. Started calling steel contractors, visited construction sites, showed up uninvited to building projects, demo unit in hand, welding studs to exposed beams while engineers protested. You don't need to drill that. Watch this. 1 second. Pop. Solid weld. Their jaws dropped. The same men who'd spent hours fastening brackets now looked like fools with wrenches. April 1946. The first civilian contract hit. Came from a steelworks firm building a new skyscraper in Los Angeles. They needed a way to fasten floor decking to beams, faster than bolts, but safer than spot welding. Ted delivered. By the end of the month, stud welding was the standard on the project, and by summer, the word had spread across the West Coast. You want it done fast? Call Nelson. The phones started ringing again, not with military orders, but architects, engineers, and builders. August 1946. The comeback begins. A new sign went up outside the factory. Nelson Welding Systems for ships, steel and skyscrapers with the help of his old crew, many of whom returned. As soon as the doors reopened, Ted shifted. Production from war to work site. He hired engineers to redesign the guns for civilian use, made the flux caps easier to swap. Added safety features. By late 1947, Nelson Welding was serving every major construction firm west of the Rockies. October 1948. A government letter. Again one morning, Emma handed him a familiar-looking envelope. Ted hesitated before opening it. Mr. Nelson, the U.S. Department of Labor is seeking your consultation on how to modernize construction efficiency nationwide. Your work during the war proved that seconds matter. We believe you can help us reclaim them in peace. Federal Infrastructure Office. Ted chuckled, holding the letter. They finally figured it out, he murmured. Emma smirked. Only took a world war. A world war. June 1949, Chicago, Illinois. The skyline of post-war America was rising, steel and glass shooting toward the clouds like victory monuments. The Randolph Tower, Prudential Building, Equitable Life Tower, each one taller than the last, and buried deep within their bones, welded quietly to every crossbeam and bracket, was Ted Nelson's invention. Stud by stud, second by second, his wartime gun was now rebuilding a peacetime world. At the American Institute of Steel Construction Conference, Nelson was invited to speak, not as a defense contractor, not as a veteran, but as a visionary. The ballroom was packed. Suits, engineers, big money, men with soft hands and hard opinions. He took the stage, still in his work boots and tan shirt, and began without ceremony. They told me my idea was impossible, said it would take years to approve, said it didn't follow the proper channels. He held up one of his original flux-capped studs. This little piece of ceramic and steel saved 50 million man-hours during the war. It didn't need permission. It just needed to work. Silence. Then applause. September 1950. The suitors arrived. That speech lit a fire. Suddenly, Nelson Welding was on everyone's radar. General Electric, United States Steel, Lockheed, Ford. Big corporations lined up, Checkbooks open. We want exclusive rights. License it to us for automotive use. Let's scale it globally. Name your price. One company sent a legal team with a 60-page contract offering a full acquisition. $3 million all cash, enough to retire forever. Emma read the numbers and said, "This would change our lives." Ted just shook his head. "I didn't build this to cash out. I built it to work better." But he knew the wolves wouldn't stop circling. December 1950. TRW makes its move. TRW, a powerful industrial conglomerate, made the approach differently. No lawyers, no press, just a quiet meeting in a Cleveland office. Their pitch was simple. We'll buy your company, keep your name, expand your technology, and preserve your legacy. We're not here to erase what you built. We're here to help the world use it. For the first time, Ted didn't feel like a product. They treated him like a pioneer. After weeks of thinking, he called Emma to the workshop. He handed her the contract. Signed. They can build it bigger, but I built it first. January 1st, 1951, a new era. Begins Nelson Welding became a division of TRW. Ted took a new role as Chief Innovation Advisor. A fancy title, but he still wore his work clothes, still rode the bus to work, still kept the first welding gun mounted above his desk. Now, his invention was going places he'd never imagined. Nuclear power plants used stud welds to secure control rods. Highway bridges fastened railings, power boxes, and steel grates with Nelson's system. Skyscrapers from New York to Tokyo used his studs to tie structural steel together. Even NASA began inquiries. Rockets were made of complex alloys, but they still needed brackets, frames, and fasteners, and Nelson's system worked in zero-gravity tests. His mistake had left Earth's orbit. April 1953. A whisper in the workshop one day. An old friend from the Mare Island days visited Ted in San Leandro. A retired engineer named Hartwell, the same man who once dismissed Nelson's idea as naive. He stood silently in the workshop for a long moment, then finally said, "You remember what I told you back in '41? "Sure do," Ted replied. "If it was that easy, someone would have done it already." Hartwell chuckled. "I was wrong." Ted leaned on the bench and smiled. "No, you were right. It wasn't easy. I just did it anyway." July 1954. A legacy without a monument by. Now, Nelson's technology had been adopted in over 70 countries, translated into 14 languages, installed in tens of thousands of structures. Still, there were no statues, no history books, no parades, only the quiet sound of welding guns echoing across the world, stud by stud, second by second. A war won, a world rebuilt. One man's mistake, still holding everything together. April 1968. Vallejo, California. Ted Nelson sat quietly on a weathered bench near the waterfront of the old Mare Island shipyard, the very place that once dismissed his idea like it was the rambling of a grunt too low in rank to be worth hearing. The shipyard had changed since the war. It was quieter now. The fires of urgency had cooled. No more frantic welders racing deadlines. No more sirens echoing across dry docks. The war was over. The Cold War simmered, and the shipyards had returned to something resembling peace. But the ghosts were still here. Ted watched as the USS Drum, a nuclear-powered submarine, glided silently through the bay. She was the last submarine built in California, a machine of terrifying grace, bristling with modern weapons and hidden power. But Ted didn't see the reactor. He didn't see the sonar domes. He saw the studs. He saw the welds. He saw the echoes of a garage in Vallejo, where he had built the first gun with parts scavenged from scrap yards, and faith. And now, even the Navy had adopted it as standard issue. Nelson Stud Welding, printed right in the manuals. To USS Pampanito, San Francisco, he stood below deck in the narrow, claustrophobic halls of the USS Pampanito, now retired and converted into a museum docked at the Embarcadero. A tour guide didn't recognize him, just called him Sir, and kept walking. Ted didn't mind. He wasn't there for recognition. He was there for the sound, the feel. He placed his hand against a section of steel bulkhead that had been refitted using his studs during restoration. Even now, volunteers were using modern Nelson equipment to keep her seaworthy. Easy to learn, easy to use, reliable, fast. One of the volunteers, barely 20 years old, fired a stud gun with a practiced pop. Ted smiled. "Nice weld," the kid grinned. "Thanks. I think the guy who invented this must have been a genius." Ted just nodded and walked on. 983. No parade. No plaque. Ted Nelson had received awards. 2 Army-Navy E awards, signed letters from the Secretary of the Navy, a framed commendation from the Department of Labor, even a modest federal pension increase for technical contributions to wartime production. But no monument, no school named after him, no chapter in history. Books. The world had moved on, and Ted was fine with that. As he often said, the only thing that matters is whether it works, not whether they spell your name right. He spent his last working years consulting for infrastructure projects, bridges in the Midwest, oil rigs in the Gulf, and even advising on skyscrapers in South America. His final notebook, Volume 27, was filled with sketches, weld calculations, and one repeating scribble on the inside cover. There's always a faster way. You just have to build it before they say you can't. 994. Vallejo, California. Ted Nelson passed away peacefully at the age of 89, surrounded by family. He left behind no personal fortune. He never lived in a mansion. He never drove a fancy car. His only real luxury was a workshop out back and a garage full of tools that still smelled of scorched steel and victory. His obituary was modest, just a few lines in the Vallejo Times-Herald. Theodore E. Nelson, WW2 welder and inventor, dies at 89, helped revolutionize naval ship construction, survived by his wife, 2 children, and the tools he never stopped using. 2010. Rediscovery. A team of restoration engineers working on the battleship USS Texas stumbled upon something strange. Thousands of stud welds dated back to 1943. Still intact. Still strong. They traced the origin to the Nelson welding system. One engineer, a young woman named Lydia, barely out of grad school, began researching the process. What she found stunned her. A welder. Not an engineer, not a general, not a bureaucrat. A welder had built this, and the more she dug, the more she realized. No Ted Nelson. No 50 million man-hours saved. No subs on time. No war won as fast. She published an article in the Journal of Military Engineering. The welder who built the war. How Ted Nelson's stud gun changed everything. It went viral in niche circles. A short documentary followed. A plaque was finally installed at Mare Island. In honor of Theodore E. Nelson, welder, inventor, patriot. His idea, once dismissed, helped build the fleet that won the war. Present day, every stud still counts. Today, Nelson's invention is used on every continent. His stud welding guns are found in skyscrapers, submarines, solar farms, wind turbines, bridges, stadiums, and even Mars rover assembly lines. Robotic welders now handle what his spring-loaded gun once did by hand. But the principle remains: fast, strong, efficient. Second per stud, no scaffolding required, and somewhere, in every steel beam holding up the modern world, there is a whisper, a trace, of Ted Nelson. Not the millionaire, not the hero, not the myth, but the welder, the one who asked, "There has to be a better way," and then built it when no one believed he could. Final line, let the record show. A man with a tool, a notebook, and a refusal to accept waste saved more time than any general, and in doing so, helped save the world.